Hello and welcome back to Gooder's Front Room with me, Gooder. I've been thinking about what I want to do with the channel, and I've decided I'm going to move towards producing more detailed videos but at a slower rate, rather than shorter quick review videos. Probably going to aim for about one a week. Here's the first one in the new style. Please do let me know in the comments if it's an approach you like. As the 1990s began, horror films were floundering at the box office, and the genre was increasingly seen as a home screen experience, with film rental stores filled with lurid covers and controversies over video nasties in the press. Early in the decade, there were a couple of crossover hits with Arachnophobia and Coppola's version of Dracula, but revenues for the genre continued to fall as it relied on endless sequels to legacy properties and in general quite poor quality fare. For example, 1992's Child Play 3 had a take which was down $14 million compared to the second film in the series, which had been released only a year prior. Wes Craven's New Nightmare took $18 million at the US box office against a budget of $8 million in 1994, and the latest instalments of Halloween and the Friday the 13th franchises both brought in rather meagre $15 million returns in the first half of the decade. Then, in 1996, the horror genre found itself in the centre of the cultural conversation again, for better or for worse, when a new film appeared from a first-time writer that took the slasher horror template and updated it for a new, more pop culture savvy audience. Racing to $103 million at the US box office, the film's financial and critical success kicked off a new wave of cinematic horror. Scream rang out and was heard industry-wide. So let's take a look at the film's production, the film itself, and the legacy it left behind. Writer Kevin Williamson at first was inspired to write the first draft of what would go on to become the screenplay for Scream, as he watched the ongoing reporting around the Gainesville Ripper, a serial killer by the name of Danny Rolling, who killed 4 young women and a young man during August 1990. Rolling would break into his victims' homes and brutally attack them. He was arrested on a burglary charge later that year, and the tools he'd used were found to match those used to break into the murdered victims' homes. Audio diaries he'd recorded alluding to the crimes were then also found. At his trial in 1994, Rolling stated his motive was to be a superstar like Ted Bundy, who he idolised. Rolling would be convicted and sentenced to execution. Writing a first draft in less than a week, and 2 days after putting the finished script, then known as Scary Movie, up for sale, Williamson found a bidding battle emerging despite its gory nature. Paramount and Universal were amongst those interested, but eventually Dimension Films bought the screenplay for $400,000, including in the deal a contract for at least 2 sequels. Work began to find a director for the project. Robert Rodriguez, Danny Boyle, George A. Romero, and Sam Raimi were all approached. However, Williamson was concerned that none of them saw the film the same way that he did, with many of the directors appearing to consider the film an outright comedy after reading the script. Wes Craven, a stalwart of the horror genre, had been approached early in the process, but had passed with a remake of The Haunting in development. When that collapsed, Craven agreed to join the project, noting that with a mainstream actress in Drew Barrymore already on board, there was a good chance there was enough momentum in place to create something different to his past projects, with Craven having grown weary of what he saw as the inherent misogyny and violence in the genre. To what extent he succeeded in that is open to debate. Barrymore's involvement set the film apart from other horror efforts even at this early stage. It was initially intended that she would take the film's central role as Sidney Prescott, but in what turned out to be a fortuitous turn of events, a clash of commitments saw Barrymore take the smaller role of Casey, the film's first victim. The fact that the film's biggest star was the first to be killed undoubtedly helped the film convey a sense that no one in its cast of characters was safe. Neve Campbell, known for Party of Five, would step in to take the lead role. Courtney Cox, like Barrymore, asked to be involved herself after reading the script, intent on playing Gail to counterbalance her image from starring in Friends. Skeet Ulrich had worked with Campbell recently, and their familiarity helped him win the role of Billy Loomis. David Arquette was asked to read for the part of Billy, but instead asked to be considered as Dewey Riley, a role originally conceived as a more straightforward, heroic lawman. But Craven was enthused by Arquette's softer, almost comedic approach to the part. The cast was rounded out by Jamie Kennedy, Rose McGowan, Matthew Lillard, and Liev Schreiber, all in relatively early career roles. Scream started to attract controversy early on in production. An agreement had been made with Santa Rosa High School to use the building to film the school set scenes. However, after a series of protests from parents and local newspapers over the violent content of the film, the school's board ended up refusing to allow the school to be used. Meanwhile, the infamous Ghostface killer mask was a chance find during location scouting, when one of the crew saw it hanging from a peg inside a house. Part of a costume design that belonged to the Funworld company, the production team at first attempted to replicate the design with enough changes to circumvent copyright issues. But Craven wasn't happy with any of these tweaked designs and convinced the studio to reach an agreement with Funworld for use of the mask. The film itself opens with essentially what is a cold opening, dropping the audience straight into a tension-filled sequence that sets the film stall out early with a number of references to existing horror films. Craven quickly puts his skill set to use, building up a heart-pounding tension, the ringing of the phone almost becoming an act of violence itself. The question, "Do you like scary movies?" would become iconic. The sequence is helped by that fortunate twist in the casting, when the biggest name in the cast is killed, almost escaping, only to be struck down within sight of safety. The audience shown that no character is safe. From here, the film sets up some classic horror characters, as we are introduced to Sydney, the innocent teenage girl, note the plain nightgown, and her boyfriend Billy. His surname Loomis, a nod to Halloween. As he's introduced, I'm sure Billy is supposed to be coming across as charming. However, looking back at the film now, if it was made today, I don't think it would have been written in the same way, as he essentially tries to pressure Sydney into having sex with him. By this point in his career, Craven had begun to be wary of the misogyny present in many films of the horror genre, and part of his intention with Scream was to move the genre beyond that. But, as said, the extent to which he succeeds is open to debate. Sydney does prove herself to be smart and capable, as does Gail, the two of them combining to turn the tables on their tormentors at the end of the film. However, we still have things like the bitchy schoolgirl stereotype present in the film. Sydney herself tells her friend that Billy would be within his rights to break up with her because she hasn't slept with him yet, and indeed Sydney's more promiscuous friend is killed. Yes, Sydney does avoid being the virgin survivor template by the end of the film, but it does appear that her choice to sleep with Billy comes out of a feeling of guilt for at one point believing him to be involved in the murders, a belief that of course does turn out to be right. Speaking of which, the film is not subtle in highlighting its third act twist to the audience. Billy's first appearance is soundtracked by a cover of Don't Fear the Reaper. At one point, the background music at a party greets his arrival with the lyric, "My boyfriend lies." At other points, we see him and his partner gleefully discuss violent acts, but we are led to believe it's just teenage boys making bad taste jokes. This also helps feed into one of the film's running themes, which is the idea that the younger generation has been desensitized to violence and murder by a combination of horror films and media hysteria around violent crime. Henry Winkler's Principal Himbry actually vocalizes this as the film sets him up as a rather obvious red herring, and we see many of his pupils race to the scene of his recently found mutilated body, giddy with excitement. Of course, the main thing the film is remembered for is its subversion of the horror genre. There is the iconic rule scene, although this doesn't actually appear until over 70 minutes in, and by then the film has already used quite a number of horror references, either to outright mock its forebears or highlight the common cliches. A number of the characters do act against the rules for survival. Don't have sex, don't drink or do drugs, never say "I'll be back," but the film does subvert expectations in other ways. For example, during the stalking and chasing sequences, the ghost-faced killer takes a number of hits and suffers falls and trips, a marked difference from the unstoppable golems that Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees had steadily become. The stumbling nature of the killer is a factor that helps humanize the killers, making them strangely more relatable as characters, rather than just figures of paranormal horror, and so, in a way, more frightening. It is something that Williamson did spend some time thinking about. The decision to give Billy a motive for his actions grounds him as a character, but it does create issues around what basically amounts to the slut-shaming of Sidney's mother. Stuart, being presented as a much more sociopathic figure, was down to Williamson's thinking that also including a killer with seemingly no motive added to the fright factor. The idea of killing for the renown and an attention, often remembered as part of this film, is actually something more developed in the second entry in the series. As already mentioned, the film was a big success at the box office and was met with surprisingly positive reviews for a slasher horror film. In terms of cinema, it shot life back into the ailing horror genre as a burst of similar films appeared. Williamson himself followed up with I Know What You Did Last Summer, and later on his take on the alien body snatcher tale with The Faculty, as well as Scream 2. Also taking Scream's template for slasher films with a contemporary feel, and often a recognisable lead from a team-aimed TV show, were the likes of Disturbing Behaviour, Urban Legend, House on Haunted Hill, with the Final Destination series being arguably the last franchise that launched as part of this wave in 2000. We then start to see the emergence of the found footage trend with the Blair Witch Project. Then in the early 2000s there is the brief flood of American versions of Japanese and Korean horrors, and alongside that there's the emergence of what wrongly or rightly is called the torture porn genre with Cabin Fever and Saw. Whilst there is no doubt that Scream showed that horror could still be financially successful, its imaginative approach soon drained away. The film itself went on to become an increasingly stretched franchise, like the ones it had argued were tired. Elsewhere, the industry fell back into a pattern of repeatedly going back to the same well, producing sequel after sequel for a handful of successful franchises. Final Destination alone racked up 5 entries in just over 10 years. The tired horror market then followed patterns from elsewhere in Hollywood, and we started to see remakes of the old franchises, which then themselves were followed by a string of sequels. What does appear to have happened off the back of Scream is that the cycle has accelerated. A small budget horror film is released, becomes a hit, sequels are rushed into production as quickly as possible. The first sequel improves upon the first one at the box office, but then audience interest drops and following sequels quickly perform worse and worse. The change is before Scream, it would take often a few years between not only sequels, but also between those films that would capture imagination and lead to franchises of their own. Now, sequels appear within 18 months at least, and often within a year, whilst new franchises seem to get started every year. Think of things like The Conjuring, Paranormal Activity. And whilst the genre is still probably healthier than it was before Scream, it's notable that this return to sequelitis has seen most of these franchises earning less at the box office than the Scream series itself did in its heyday. Away from the screen, Scream has also left a legacy and impact on wider society. The film has been named as a factor in a number of murders and attacks, often with the ghost face mask being found among items earned by the perpetrators. A number of these involved teenagers, and the film quickly found itself in the centre of discussions on violence in media and its availability to the young, and questions of censorship. In the crimes it was connected to, the film was found to be a factor amongst many other elements that had led to the violence, but it became a point of focus for news media reporting. And after the terrible events at the Columbine High School, scenes from the film were shown to the United States Senate Commerce Committee during discussions on marketing of violent films to children. Reading through the transcript of the committee hearings, it is pretty much a roll call of Republican senators blaming everything they can for events aside from the availability of guns and lack of mental health provisions. Scream, as a high-profile series, found itself drawn into these hearings. Reading these minutes is a little dispiriting, as there was definitely room for a serious discussion around the issues of violence depiction in society, but the majority of the senators involved used it for moral groundstanding instead. 25 years after its release, Scream remains a cultural landmark for a number of reasons. Viewed today, it is still an effective and inventive film. It relaunched the genre, but in the end seems to have done little to change that genre's overall landscape. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts below on the film and its legacy, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and I'll be back soon.